And so at that point, you've entered the slot cars leg where you're basically stuck for the next 15 degrees of longitude. Now to get to that point, and this is, if you survived the getting around Catalina and you survived getting to the synoptic breeze the first night, the choice of where to cross the ridge is the single most important decision of your Transpac. And if you get it wrong, you're going to hate life from then on. But once you pick the point on the ridge, getting to that point is pretty straightforward. Most boats, you just go straight at it. Really, really tender boats, sometimes it pays to sag a little bit early and then come up a little bit later. Cal 40s just point straight at it. Comanche, you point straight at it. But nevertheless, that first leg going to the point on your slot cars, that's when you're going to go through all of your sail changes. So you'll round the west end, you probably still have your, in the Cal 40 example, you probably still have your 150 on, and then you go to your 3, and then you go to your small blast reacher, then you put up a staysail, then you go to your jib top, and then you put up a staysail, and then at that point you get your shy light kite up or your A sail up, and then after that you're on your symmetric. And the interesting thing is that the later part of those transitions all happen really quickly. Meaning once you start approaching the ridge, the shift happens very quickly. And when you first put up a kite, you can just barely carry your shy kite, and you think you might have set it too soon, and then within 2 or 3 hours, it's, you hoist your 3/4 and you start pulling the pull back. So that transition of crossing the ridge happens very quickly. On a higher performance boat, the names of the sails are all different. You're on your J1, and then maybe you're on your J3, and then you're on your masthead through your blade, fractional blade. And then you go to your fro, the fractional reacher, and then you go to your masthead 0. So the sails all have different names, but it's the same exercise. A lot of sail changes through there. And if you really want to sail your boat properly, you need to have a really good idea of your polars and your sail charts, and you need to know just when those changes are. Because if you make one of those changes too late, you will have left some miles on the table. And so we, on Comanche, to prepare for the Hobart race as an example, we spent 70 days practicing. And most of those days were spent practicing sorting out those sail chart angles of all of those different combinations, between fetching upwind and your BMG angles, just making sure we knew exactly where the edges were of the different combinations. So that's that first leg you see on the right, from the synoptic breeze edge to the edge of the slot cars leg. Most boats, the approximation of just going straight is actually pretty good, but obviously, you want to step into your new sail. It's okay to sail a little bit low, and then as you get lifted, you carry it up above your course a little bit, and then you step into your next sail. And you just need to be aggressive and know where those transitions are. But where you're going is you're going to that waypoint on the ridge. Once you get to the waypoint on the ridge, that's pretty much you for the next couple of days. So you pick your waypoint on the ridge. If you're too far north, you picked a waypoint that's too far up, then you run out of wind before you get to the ship. And so you're not able to jibe on a nice angle, but nevertheless, you're too close to the high, you're running out of breeze, you can't sail lower than your BMG angles, and if you jibe, you get screwed. So you have to decide whether you're all going to go up there and die in the high, or whether you're going to jibe and lose the race. And so then when you jibe, you basically cross the transoms of the boats below you. If you're too far south, you've sailed extra miles needlessly to get to the ridge, and you can't cash them in, because the boats that are properly to the north of you, they get lifted up in front of you, and then they jibe and cross your bow. As a navigator, it's a less embarrassing mistake to make, to be too far south than to too far north. Because if you're too far north, there's no hiding. You're in trouble. If you're too far south, it's somewhat of a more gentle mistake to make, but you still can't win the race if you have a sister ship that got it right. So you pick your ridge waypoint and you pick the course based on the expected strength and location of the high when you're in that slot cars leg from 130 to 45. And basically what you're shooting for is to make sure that just about the time You're as close to the high as you want to be. The wind is far enough around so that you can get onto Port Jibe. The router will take you too far north, and this is a kind of a question, an answer to the question about do you just trust Expedition? And the answer in this case is no, you can't. Expedition will always take you too close to the high and too far north during the slot cars leg. And the reason is important to understand, that your polars may be perfect if you've done your homework, and the weather data is actually remarkably good. Even on the south edge of the high, as you'll discover during return trips. The GFS is extraordinary in those conditions, mid-latitude, south edge of the high. So why does Expedition take you too far north? Well, the reason is, in the real world, things happen. We get light spots under some clouds, we get helms people who lose concentration, the spinnaker collapses, and no matter what happens and no matter what causes it to happen, the response is the boat has to sail higher for a while. So the spinnaker collapses, you go a little higher. You get a light spot under a cloud, you go a little higher. The helmsman loses concentration, you go a little higher. Each of those things happens, it takes you a little higher. Now the fact that you're a little bit higher, the wind's a little bit lighter, and so you have to sail a little higher still. So pretty soon you're going higher and higher, and then you spin off into the high, and you're stuck. And so it's like computing with your computer. What's the fastest way to walk around the Grand Canyon? Well, obviously the answer is right on the very edge. Where the edge of your foot is overlapped the edge of the Grand Canyon. Well, would any sensible person do that? Of course not. Because if you're going to walk around the Grand Canyon, at some point you're going to put your foot in the wrong spot and then you're done. So it's the same thing with the high. Expedition is going to assume your polars are perfect. It's going to assume the weather's perfect. Those assumptions are actually quite good. But nevertheless, you sail in the real world, and there's light spots, and there's helmsmen that lose concentration, and then there's helmsmen that just get sloppy and just take it easy and sail too hot for a little while. So you have to give yourself a little bit of margin. So what you want to do for your ridge crossing is use Expedition as the northern wall. And you'd never want to pick a course north of that. But nevertheless, you have to use some human intelligence to figure out how far south of that to go. If you pick the ridge waypoint perfectly, then what you're going to do is you're going to be comfortable during the slot cars leg to sail what the guys I sail with, what we call ocean downwind angles. So they're not inshore VMG angles where you're torturing the boat low with an A4. They're sort of hot downwind angles where you're heated up and the boat's rumbling along and you're pretty comfortable. And some people used to call this wally, some people used to call it footing to the header or heating it up to the lift when you're going downwind. There's a lot of different terminology in sailing. Expedition will get this right if your polars are right. And Expedition will show you sailing hot at your inshore VMG angles during the entire slot car's leg. But nevertheless, if you do get it right, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be rumbling along during that slot car leg 3 or 4 degrees hot of your inshore VMG angles. If you ended up making the mistake that you got too far north, and this can happen. It happened, I think it was 99, I'm trying to remember the year. But the entire fleet of sleds ended up too far north because the weather models just changed. And so we all found ourselves north of where we wanted to be. And I remember on Highwacket, I lost a lot of friends by just torturing the crew to get south, to sail absolutely, inshore angles. And I just, giving the helmsman a hard time the entire time. When we were sailing, we were jibing on 10-degree unfavored port jibes to get south. But it was just a hugely painful process. And I was taking a huge amount of grief, especially from Robbie, because we were losing 5 miles a day to Mark Rudiger on Silver Bullet, who was north of us, because they were rumbling along and they weren't trying so hard to fight south. And so, every day we'd lose 5 miles, but every day we'd gain a few miles to the south. We'd gain on the track I wanted to be on. And at some point it was getting close to the point where I think Robbie was going to fire me. And so then I told Robbie, look, let's bet a bottle of scotch. And my bet is, I'll bet you a bottle of Lagavulin that by tomorrow morning's roll call will gain 25 miles in silver bullet. Wow. Robbie took the bet instantly, and I won. Because the next day, finally the thing happened that I was banking on. And Silver Bullet found themselves in an impossible situation where they were too close to the high, but they couldn't bring themselves to jive because they'd be heading behind our transit. And so they basically just spun out of the race. So I won the bet, but I had to sue Robbie to get him to pay up. So Robbie gave me a miniature from the airplane. Unfortunately, Benny Mitchell's a lawyer, so we held court. And the team voted, and I won the lawsuit. 500 millibar charts. You know, a lot of people ask the question, and it's a good question, does it make sense to horse around looking at weather maps and 500 millibar charts and to, eyeballing weather maps and ourselves when, in fact, we download group files and run Expedition and it tells us where to go? The answer still is yes. It's helpful to be able to look at a weather map, understand the issues, pose the questions in your mind, and I always look at the weather maps first. I always do an eyeball route, make my own sort of human decisions based on it, and then I start running the expedition routes. And then when you start running your expedition routes, you always want to think of the questions. Well, how much slower would it be if we did this? How important is the strength of the high, or the speed of this low, or whatever it is? And then you force Expedition to answer those questions. But you always, with every model run, you always want to come up with the 10 or 12 what-if questions so that you truly understand what the model is telling you. But it's very helpful to understand the weather map because some of those what-if questions are associated with the weather. What if that low is moving faster? What if it's moving slower? What if there's a little more wind, less wind? Why is the optimum route what it is? And how critically is that affected by various aspects of the weather? And I think the 500 millibar charts is a helpful thing to be able to have some intuition on for the Transpac. If there's an omega block, meaning 500 millibar, the jet stream shows a big wave in it, then the high is going to be very well behaved and it's going to be dependable. And if the high is pretty far north, well, it's going to stay there and you can count on it. You can take it to the bank. If you have 500 millibar flow, the jet stream is zonal, meaning it's pretty much going straight across. Well, you may have a surface chart that looks like a very strong high, but don't trust it. Because a high in that sort of situation with zonal flow, 6 hours later, the models could show it much further south. And then the interesting thing about the 500 millibar charts is that's how all of these weather models compete. Meaning if you go to these websites that compare the performance of different weather models around the world, they're not comparing surface charts. They're comparing the 500 millibar charts. And so the models all do a pretty good job of that. And so it's worth understanding that, and it's worth understanding what the 500 millibar chart looks like for different kinds of races. On the other hand, I think you can do a reasonable job, using your surface forecasts. But nevertheless, I think it's interesting as navigators to try to strengthen your arsenal and use the 500 millibar as well. So you race in your slot to the shift. The best ridge crossing, as we mentioned, gives you the confidence to sail your ocean downwind angles, meaning slightly hot to the lip. If you're too far north, the first thing you do is you don't do that. You sail your inshore BMG angles, and that gets you a little bit lower and slower. And then the next thing you do is you start to be willing to jibe and take port jibes that are unfavored. So you're starting to pay more and more to get further south. And you have to decide how much to pay. Even if you're on the perfect slot and you're happy with it, in a warm water year, there will be big enough squalls and big enough shifts to where you want to be jibing in the shifts. So you always want to be optimizing your distance, along that track you want to make good. So you still will jibe, even if you're happy with your slot. It's expensive to change lanes to the left, but if you screwed up and you got too far north, or if the weather system changed and you got too far north, it's even more expensive not to do it. And here, yeah, this confirms it was 1999, that example where the whole sled fleet ended up too far north. But the boats that fought to get south were the boats that ended up winning. Sources of weather data. Can you guys read this? Is the text too readable on the back? No? Okay, well then feel free to come up and take a look at it. And we'll spend a little time on this on the screen, but don't hesitate to stand up.
Can you post those slides too?
Yeah, these slides are all posted.
You're showing Self-Flow Pro.
I can't even read my computer version of this, so I'll read this one.
So this top row
Is mesoscale. The bottom row,
the global models.
this column here is data that costs money. And as you all know, that you can't pay for data during the Transpac. There's no limit on what you can pay for communications by satellite, but the data has to be free. So this column is row that's legal to use, there's a column that's legal to use during the race, because the data itself is free. Okay, so mesoscale, in terms of the paid services, we're in an interesting situation where you can pay to get the pro SailFlow mesoscale data, you can pay to get PWE and PWG from Predict Wind, you can pay to get TideTech, and all of that stuff is legal to use before the prep signal. And you'd certainly want to use it before the prep signal as an alternate opinion. But the interesting thing about the mesoscale data when we race in sort of the continental US waters is that the very best source of data is free. This is the HRRR, and the second runner-up is the NAM. And they're both available for free. SailFlow observations you have to be very careful with, because most of your crew members will have a subscription to SailFlow on their phones. And most of those subscriptions are paid subscriptions. So in San Francisco Bay, people pull out their phones and they say, oh, it's blowing 12 at the Golden Gate. And they just cheated, because the Golden Gate doesn't show up unless it's under the paid subscription. And so it's a really common way of people inadvertently cheating is to use their SailFlow subscription on their phone. And so what you have to do as navigator and have to tell the crew to do is that if they want to look at SailFlow during the race, they have to log out of their paid subscription and then log in with a free subscription. But that's an important thing to be aware of. The HRRR is available for free. It's very high resolution, 1.6 mile resolution, and it updates hourly. The SailFlow observations, that's a useful way to get the observations, but you have to, again, stick to the free ones to be legal. NOAA has a site called the NOAA Ready site, and it gives you graphic access to all of the data that NOAA has, all the different models. It has the high-tech stuff if you love weather, like the CAPE, the convective available potential energy, the lifting index, QT soundings. It's hostile as can be, but it's a really interesting way if you're an enthusiast on weather to really get a good understanding on weather. And it's a fabulous way of being able to predict when the thermal breeze, when the sea breeze is going to start, and the drainage breeze will stop in many areas around the world. And it is available worldwide. So it's a terrific way to, if you're in the Med or in the Caribbean or something, it's a great way to be able to understand the transition to a sea breeze. The weather radio is typically free around the world. So that's the mesoscale stuff. Global. Let me just comment a little bit about the difference between mesoscale and global. The mesoscale models, they have much more detailed terrain models, thermal models, the reflectivity of the land, the dampness of the land. They do a really nice job of all of that. And they work really well when you're in the effects of terrain. But you don't ever want to use a mesoscale model once you're out into the synoptic breeze. because the mesoscale models don't work as well as the global models once you're outside of terrain effects. And it's an easy mistake to make, because you'll look at HRR and you'll say, oh, terrific, it goes out 120 miles. Well, let's use it all the way to the edge. That's a mistake. What you want to do is you want to use the mesoscale model until you're into the synoptic breeze, and then you put it behind you, and then use the global model from that point forward. So the global models don't work as well as the mesoscale models within terrain effects, but something that a lot of people haven't, may not be aware of is that the mesoscale models don't work as well as the global models when you're outside of terrain effects. Then they run them further out, I think, to deal with the boundary effects at the edge of the model. So it's just easier for the weather modelers to run the mesoscale models further out than they need, but they don't work well in that outside edge. So the global models have limited terrain modeling, although it is increasing. The global models, they underestimate small features like fronts and tropicals. So in a small tropical storm or a small brand new low pressure area, because it's small, the GFS will dramatically underestimate it. So if you see a little tropical that shows 40 knots in the GFS, that's a big problem. It's probably going to blow 80 knots. And it's a known characteristic of the GFS. There's even a warning in every sail doc's email that mentions that the GFS underestimates the speed in tropicals, but nevertheless, it's something to keep aware of. When you ask Joe Sinkowitz, why is it? They have this known defect, why do they live with it? He says, well, if they try to fix it, it causes the whole model to go unstable. So what they have to do is they have to underestimate the wind in these very, very small features. So it's not a mysterious characteristic. It's just something that we all live with. The global models, like the GFS or the FV3, they work fabulously out to 3 days. They're very good out 3 to 6 days, and they're pretty much fiction beyond 7 days. And it's really interesting that over the last 15 years, they've moved that sort of boundary of utility, out to 7 days, but it hasn't been moving much beyond that. And there's some sort of stochastic modelers that say that that it'll be really hard because of the way chaos works to really move that boundary too much beyond 7 days. Okay, for the global stuff, this box is pretty much irrelevant for this race, but I'll describe it because as navigators, you will occasionally race in a race that allows you to pay for data. The Hobart race lets you pay for data, the Fastnet race lets you pay for data, the Caribbean 600. So in those races where you can pay for data, you can get real-time satellite imagery, the infrared imagery. It's a fabulous way of seeing whether there's convection and a squall in front of the boat. So for multi-hulls, it's hugely valuable. The ECMWF, you can pay for that and get 12-hour updates. Some people think, well, historically it has been working better than the GFS over the last decade. Right now, I don't think it is. Right now, I think the new FV3 is working just as well in the areas where we sail. The FV3 isn't working quite as well as the ECMWF in areas where it's really cold, and snowing and things like that. But in areas where we race, I think the FV3 is just as good. So that's taken away the emphasis from the EC. And then the other thing that's a shortfall of the EC is that it only updates every 12 hours, whereas the FV3 and the GFS update every 6 hours. And then for the stuff that's legal to use in the Transpac, the GFS, obviously, the FV3 I think is even better. The FV3 may replace the GFS in mid-June. So that would affect all of you if NOAA decides to do that. And at that point, there'd be no difference, of course, between the FV3, because I think what they will do is they will rename the FV3 to be the GFS, and all you would notice is a slight improvement. Ask Joe Sinkowitz about it when he does the weather briefing, because at that point, he will know.
We get it from sail docks?
I'm sorry?
We get FV3 from sail docks?
Yes, you can get FV3 from sail docks, and you actually have been able to for quite some time now. Occasionally, the ECMWF is available for free, like it was for the last Transpac. so that we could all use it during the Transpac. I haven't been able to find a source of free EC now. So for this Transpac, well, let me ask the group, do any of you, have you found a free source with the ECMWF? Okay, so that means we can't use it, but we can use it before the start for a fee. And then once after the start, and some of us can find a free source, then we're basically stuck with the FP3. But the good news is, I think the FP3 is just as good. Questions?
So
Yes.
satellite imagery is also available on NOAA.
They are, but the best way to get them is through Squid. And the reason that you get them through Squid or Great Circle is that their client that runs in your program and your laptop does a fabulous job of overlaying them. Again, over the nautical chart and over the grid file and over the the weather map. And so it's just a huge convenience. So this was a service that was first built by the French Ensign boat, is what they called it. And it was hugely expensive. It cost tens of thousands of dollars per year to subscribe to it. And all the French used it. I navigated for the French and I got absolutely hooked on it. And then Squid Great Circle is now providing the same sort of service. But it's if you're able to use it and you're sailing on a high performance boat or a multi-hull, it's just a terrific way to be able to look at the squalls ahead of the boat. And then you look at the infrared view, and if the squalls are really cold at the top, you can tell the crew with great fidelity, whether that's a scary squall or not. It's not legal to use for the Transpac. And then the old NOAA orbiters, the APT satellites that we all used to use, those are pretty much useless because you can't put them in a time loop. You get an image every few hours, and they don't really do a good job with infrared. So I don't use those anymore. And the good imagery is, there's no way to get it for free. Yes?
How do you chart our model? Is that useful in multi-channel as well?
No, they don't run the HRRR in the Hawaiian waters. And we'll get a little bit to the Molokai Channel. Interestingly, though, I think the wind in the Molokai Channel is basically determined by the synoptic breeze. Whether it's one of those years where it's fairly light, the breeze is kind of out of the east, or whether it's one of those years where the trades are smoking and it's out of the northeast. And you can also, they don't give you angles in the text weather, but you can get wind speeds off of the text weather for the winds in the Molokai Channel. And when it's windy, it's almost always out of the northeast, and when it's light, it's almost always further out of the east. So there is information to get, and the GFS worked quite well there. You just pick a point in the GFS where it's offshore a little ways, but they don't run the HRRR out there, or at least they haven't. Any other questions on this slide? Be really careful on the Transpac not to inadvertently cheat by paying for data. And the easiest way to make that mistake is to have your sail flow or your predict wind client logged in. And if you have a paid account, then you're cheating. And so you got to make sure